and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know about the news of the day. Let's start with news that authorities have received 1,721 cases of sexual crimes against children in the first 6 months of this year. Now, these statistics were revealed by the Deputy Women, Family and Community Development Minister, Siti Zailah Muhammad Yusof, in Dewan Rakyat today. And I think it's quite interesting because Siti Zailah also said that there were some efforts being made to raise awareness about sexual crimes against children through various school and public programs. But what's interesting is how exactly that's going to. We want to know a little bit more about what's being done.
Yeah, absolutely, Melissa. Of course, the MCO period and the lockdown might have had an impact on those numbers.
Right.
But I think largely the questions that I guess someone like myself might ask, looking at those numbers beyond the categorization of the types of crimes which are made available, is a little bit about the background to some of these cases. Now, who was it that helped the child perhaps expose this violation? So was it a peer? Was it a parent?
Yeah.
Teachers? And these are the individuals within the environment of the ecosystem, the milieu of the child, that should be empowered to help expose crimes. And I think maybe that is the long-term solution.
Yes, definitely so. I think that's quite important. We want to know the data behind these, the breakdown of statistics that the Deputy Minister had given to the Parliament today. But what's also interesting is, the idea of having comprehensive sexuality education. I mean, age-appropriate, of course, teaching children what these crimes are. We have to be able to have these conversations, difficult conversations with children. Good touch, bad touch, where the boundaries are, what is consent. All these things need to be taught.
Absolutely, Melissa, but because that's the hot potato, right? That's the elephant in the room. Yes. For years, we've been talking about sex education for children that goes beyond what you're taught in biology, which is, often a cross-section of a human body and told where your parts are.
Yes.
And now the complexities about this, if it's dealt with in a pragmatic sense, and I think that's sometimes what we lack in public policy, this pragmatism that puts aside the kind of political and cultural sensitivities and says that if we're really interested in helping kids, then we'll give them sex education.
Right, equip them to understand the issue at hand. Also, what was interesting was Deputy Minister talked a little bit about improving enforcement and surveillance against offenders. And I thought that was interesting because we do have a National Sex Offenders Registry. It was set up last year under the Pakatan Harapan government. But that database is limited. It only has information from 2017 onwards, and there's limited access to the public. So there's certain obstacles that the public has to go through in order to access this information. I'm sure that was put there to safeguard, privacy rights. But it does create an obstacle for people working to safeguard children's, well-being.
Yeah, I think there are 2 points that you mentioned. Privacy is very important, but also, in a culture perhaps, where the idea of, vigilantism or people taking things into their own hands might actually occur if that information is made public. I think that's worrying. We have, because over the years, Melissa, many different types of cases and varied responses to actually known cases of, say, child sexual offences. And some of them seem quite bewildering. And we remember, we cast our mind back to some of those cases.
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, we're going to keep a close eye on this and hope for more information out of the ministry. But in other news, according to the minister in the Prime Minister's department in charge of special functions, earlier today it was announced that the government was considering legislating the compulsory use of the My Sejahtera app. Datuk Sri Rizwan Yusof told Parliament today that as of last Sunday, that more than 320 positive cases of COVID were detected via the app. So I guess it shows that the app works, but whether we want to have a law to make for the mandatory use of this app it's another conversation we need to have.
Yeah, and along with the question of the use of the mask, also, Melissa, seen as something that might be subjected to some sort of legislation. I think the deep problem with this is that we don't know how long this pandemic is going to last. And it's very unclear to me whether, when it comes to issues of, of dealing with both your personal health, but also those that of the public, whether legislation is the way to go. I know we talk a lot about education.
Yes, education first, before legislation.
Yeah, but education is a long-term process, isn't it, Melissa? And there are many people who say we need the strong arm of the law in order to really deal with this pandemic. I'm not sure. I think it's a conversation that needs to happen. We are still debating whether that quantum of the fine, the
Yes.
1,000 ringgit fine, 1,000 ringgit representing perhaps somebody's entire monthly paycheck.
That's interesting that you brought that up, because earlier this morning we heard from the Deputy Health Minister that Putrajaya was considering implementing a tiered system for those fines, that 1,000 ringgit fine for those found flouting that rule. But then at a press conference later, Senior Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob said that Putrajaya will not reduce that compound. In fact, he said that, if you do get fined, you can appeal to, it is up to the Ministry of Health to deal with that appeal. It is up to the courts to deal with that appeal. So they are going to stick with that $1,000 fine, and it is up completely to you to make your case for a reduction.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a very interesting question, which is that how much of the time of the police force do we want used for what is not well, it's not a crime against people necessarily. It's very generalized, right? I mean, your particular effect on the community. But how much of police time should be devoted to this? How much does that 1,000 ringgit fine, in fact, enable or encourage corruption and in the enforcement agencies? I mean, there are a lot of issues, and I believe an MP from Sarawak already suggesting that the fines start, so that if you're a repeat offender, you get fined more. But you start small and then you move forward, and that's perhaps a way of incentivizing good behavior, not this kind of very hard, 1,000 ringgit fine.
Yeah, arm of the law. All right, we're going to take a quick break, but after this, we'll have an in-depth discussion on the future of democracy in Thailand in light of the recent protests there. That's all coming up in a few minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa. Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. There have been almost daily anti-government rallies in Bangkok in recent weeks. These demonstrations have largely been student-led, and they're calling for a revised constitution and reform of the monarchy, which is a sensitive subject in Thailand. Now, under Thai law, anyone criticizing the royal family faces long prison sentences. Joining us on the line now to help us better understand the issues in Thailand, we have Pavin Chachavalpongpun. He is an associate professor with the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University in Japan. Pavin is also the founder of the pro-democracy organization 4C, which stands for Forces of Renewal in Southeast Asia. Pavin, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm wondering if you can help us understand the call for reform of the monarchy that is behind these protests. I mean, why are these calls for reform happening now?
Well, as you yourself said, that this issue is a sensitive issue in Thailand. It's come to a point that students realize that it's time that we should talk about the monarchy. We should put the monarchy back into the constitutional framework. Since the official coronation of the current king, there has been a lot of things going on, and I think one of the factors that trigger the protest today is basically the abduction of Thai dissident in Phnom Penh. His name is Wanchalam Saksit. In fact, he's not the first. Hopefully, he will not be the last. So there has been a series of abductions and killings of Thai dissidents overseas. Why this thing has connected to the monarchy? I mean, we do not have any solid evidence, right, to connect the two together. But it happened that these people, they are anti-monarchists. So that's why there's a lot of reasons to think that there could be some kind of connection. Because of that, I think that triggers the protest. So,
Pavin, can I ask you if part of the problem here is of the character of the current monarch, who apparently lives much of his life in Germany, perhaps away from Thailand and the realities of that many Thais are suffering currently under the pandemic, and also the other issues around drought and so on and so forth that Thailand is suffering now. Is that disconnect, or the apparent disconnect between the monarch and the people of Thailand, driving some of the frustrations about the system of the current monarchy system?
Well, definitely, that would be the second factor that I would like to mention as well, because of COVID, and people have become frustrated with the with the way that the government has dealt with the situation. Of course, there are few cases in Thailand, but that doesn't mean that people really happy about that. And you yourself said that, Thai people sitting in Bangkok or any other part of the country, seeing their king, having a good time in Germany, and then making international headline like having a harem of 20 women without paying any attention to the frustration of the people. This would be the second factor that adds up to the crime across the country.
Pavin, I want to ask you about the role of Thai students in these protests. It's said that this is very much student-led, but does it resonate with other Thai citizens? Is there a generational gap or a dimension to these protests?
Yes, you are right. I mean, you can even say that this is quite a pure student-led organization or movement. Somehow, though, that the general population has started to come out to support these students. To my knowledge, there has been no political party backing these students. That's why I think they could claim legitimacy without being political, even though the issue that they are talking about is very political in itself. In many ways, the disconnection between political party and students make the call for the monarchical reform even more legitimate.
But how will the current government, the government of Prayut Chan-o-cha, deal with these protests? Surely there must be pressure on him to quell it, considering his relationship to the monarch.
Immensely. I think that the pressure on General Prayut Chan-o-cha has been so immense. And knowing the king, knowing this government, I do not see that, together they would walk out of this very easily by giving in to the protest, to the demand of the students. So that's why they started the first stage, using legal instruments against the students. So we have seen a number of cases of students being arrested and then granted bail. Today, just before talking to you a few minutes ago, another 6 students have already been arrested. So I think this is as far as the government goes right now. I don't know if the students push further, boundary, there could be a kind of crackdown. That's also a possibility.
Could you help us understand the standing of this government among the Thai people? Is it seen as legitimate? I know there was an election, but there were a lot of problems with that election, and because this is just in some ways an extension of the junta that took over through a coup. Is this government seen as legitimate and democratically elected?
You are correct in your observation that a lot of Thai people do not believe that this government is legitimate. Even though elected,ly coming into power, but we could see the shadow that has been cast, over the current government with the manipulation of the constitution that allow this government to be in power. And I think because of that, that's why the students came up with the first 3 points before it extended to monarchical reform. And the first point for them was the dissolution of the parliament, so as to call for fresh election.
Okay, and can I ask you for your thoughts on how these protests will likely play out? Pavin, what is the likely end scenario here?
I don't think the students would walk away from this very easily until the requests are fulfilled. And especially they know that they have a lot of support from the public population. And can you believe it? Now it has gone into high schools across the nation. In the past few days, you see students from high schools standing up and protest against the government too. So that say that I think the students will try to sustain this protest as far as it could go. So I think it's now a time to test the tolerance on both sides, how far the government can tolerate the protest, and at the same time, how the students, would continue to go on with their protest.
Right. Pavin, to what extent will intellectuals in Thailand and perhaps the political parties at some point feel that they need to take a stand, that they need to either ally themselves with the students or criticize the students? We know that intellectuals in Thailand have played that role in past histories of protests in What's that likely to, is that likely to happen?
Well, I mean, even talking about intellectuals, a number of them have already come out to support the students. That, I mean, undoubtedly. But I think political party, that is more important. Because for their request, for their demand to be fulfilled, it has to be formally discussed in Parliament. Otherwise, you know, I don't think this is going to take off. So I think the political party, especially the opposition, again, have been put in an awkward situation. Coming out to support students too much, they would be accused of, you know, fueling the protest against the current government. Not supporting the government at all, they kind of abandon the students, and then the demand would not go back into the Parliament. So I guess they have to strike a balance. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but at one level, we also need support from this political party too.
Pavin, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Really appreciate your time and for you sharing your insights. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but we'll be back with more, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about the future of democracy in Thailand in light of the recent protests there. Michael Vatikiotis is the Asia Director for the Centre of Humanitarian Dialogue that's based in Singapore. His latest book is Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia. Michael, good evening. Welcome to the show. Now, Thailand has seen many protests and uprisings before. I mean, what are you watching specifically with this one?
Well, you know, the period immediately before this, 2010 to 14, saw remarkable scenes of popular protest in Bangkok, which were by and large peaceful until towards the end when the army cracked down, and then there was, of course, a military coup. Although along the way there had been incidents of violence involving the army. What was different over the weekend was that we've seen just police on the streets for the time being, despite the government in Thailand being very much of a military hue. The government seems to be handling this round of protests relatively carefully and prudently, just using the police and non-violent policing for the time being. The problem that I have, in a way, with that is that one is always aware in Thailand that over the long years, back to the 1970s, where students have protested, it has inevitably led to a crackdown, a violent crackdown, which has involved the army usually, and usually also, unfortunately, bloodshed. And there are those who would argue that, you know, you're never really going to see an outcome to these protests until blood has been shed and the real talking can begin. So my fear is that we may be in for a long period of protest that may result eventually in a violent crackdown.
Michael, you know, for many years, you know, people outside of Thailand have thought of Thai politics in terms of colors, of the red shirts and the yellow shirts and the color codes, the other color-coded groups, including, I think, green for intellectuals. Tell us, what's happened to that, those dynamics? Have they completely disappeared? Are we seeing a new logic unfold in terms of alliances being made with regard to the current administration and a push against it?
Well, the polarization that has existed in Thailand since that initial period back in the, well, actually, if you could go back to 2006, it all came about with the resistance to the government of Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. And the polarization of the country divided into people who wildly and supported Thaksin, who was popular and continued to win elections, and the sort of more conservative establishment that embraced the army and the monarchy to some extent, seeing Thaksin and his cohort as essentially a threat to their conservative ways. That polarization has never really gone away. Indeed, on Sunday at the protest, there were people who were pretending to be students who were identified as coming from that sort of yellow side of things that then caused a little bit of an upheaval. So that polarization hasn't gone away. There hasn't been a reconciliation process that has brought the country together again over those issues that go back more than a decade. What is different this time, though, is both the role of the students themselves, rather than larger numbers of people from rural areas or out of town coming into the city to protest. You've seen students from campuses up and down the country coming out in sizable numbers over the weekend to manifest and register their displeasure with the current government, the legitimacy of the government, and I think very, very significantly this time around, to call for reforms, not just of the political system and the government and the constitution, but of the monarchy itself. And I think that's what has set this protest apart.
Michael, I want to ask you about the media's characterization of these protests. I mean, this is really in focus for the international community. The whole world is watching. I'm wondering whether the framing by the media of these protests have been accurate, or have there been nuances that are missed by, say, countries not within Southeast Asia?
Well, it's a general rule of thumb for me that popular protests in Southeast Asia, and it's the case in Malaysia, it's the case in Thailand, it's the case in Indonesia. There may be two aspects that are always there. One is a sort of spontaneous anger and reflecting a real sense of discontent. But there's always also an element of mobilization and organization, if not initially, then certainly exploiting popular anger. And I think the nuances probably lie in the extent to which these protests, which look as if they will go on, are going to be exploited by political forces, by factions within the establishment, and to what extent the movement itself becomes factionalized and therefore becomes rather more complicated to analyze. So with all the reform movements that we've seen, that I've experienced in the last 30 years in Southeast Asia, there's never really been a sort of enduring purity. And so one also has to look at the complex ways in which these movements are exploited by what still remains a system of politicking in Southeast Asia that is very much dominated by a narrow elite.
Speaking of elite, Michael, what do you make of the role of the monarch in this, newly minted, as it were? Do you think he has the kind of wisdom that was supposedly displayed by his father in dealing with the fissures in Thai society? Where do you think he will, or what kind of role do you think he'll be playing in the next couple of years?
It's very, very hard to say. He's a very unpredictable, mercurial personality. And, there are aspects of the last year and a half or so of his reign that have, proved that he is, to some extent, very clever about reinforcing his reign and power. But there are also puzzling and confusing aspects of, why he's not so present in the country. I don't think anyone has really gotten to the bottom of this or been able to satisfactorily explain or analyze. It is the institution of the monarchy in Thailand is not just a sensitive topic, it's also rather opaque. It's not a very transparent institution. And that's the same with, I think, monarchies across this region. That's part of the traditional mystique. I think it's something that's cultivated, a sort of distance from scrutiny and a distance from, popular knowledge. So I think that it's very hard to say.
Do you
However,
think it's likely? Do you think it's likely that the system itself is going to be called in question? We've seen monarchies go, to the, as it were, the pile of trash in history, as it were. We saw the Nepali monarchs kind of end there. Do you think Thailand might face this, a call for the end of the monarchy?
Not so far. I think what we've seen is the protesters have been careful to call for reform, for accountability. And, that's, again, I think something that we've seen down through history in this region is that, the monarchy is an enduring institution, but it is one that every now and again is called into some form of account and has to adjust. And I think that's what we're kind of looking at now.
Michael, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us from Singapore. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching and good night.